In today's video, we have some more NHL news from the Waiver Wire. We also have a potential trade brewing between the Flyers and the Predators, and we have some updated trade talk around teams like the Columbus Blue Jackets, the Florida Panthers, and yes, Jack Eichel, the Buffalo Sabres. We'll get into all the latest coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of things to talk about today. Let's start with the news from the NHL Waiver Wire. We have a couple of interesting names, and I wouldn't be completely shocked here if we did see a claim or two. There's some interesting guys who could help out other teams. We have Brett Connolly of the Florida Panthers on waivers. Now, we had mentioned him back, I want to say in the last 2 or 3 weeks, as being a potential player that Florida were shopping that could be a possible trade target, and obviously they haven't done so as of yet. I'm assuming they've had a difficult time coming to terms on any kind of deals, obviously, but now I guess they're at a point where they're willing to put him through waivers and sign him to the taxi squad if he clears, and we'll see if anybody takes on the contract. I mean, it's not a terrible contract, but at the same time, where the way he's underperformed, I guess, a bit this year, it's probably unlikely he gets claimed, but you just never know. If you look around some of the teams that have some space, but I know there's not a lot of them, that might want to add a veteran guy who can score and has proven before he can be a decent 15, 20 goal guy on a fairly consistent basis, might be something to take a look at. So we'll see if Connolly gets claimed. I still think if he goes unclaimed, that Florida will continue to try to find a deal here sometime soon for him if they're able to. And we also have goaltender Alex Stalock of the Minnesota Wild on waivers as well. There's always teams looking for goaltending depth. We've seen more goalie claims than pretty well any other position here this year, and even going back to last year as well. So another veteran guy who at times has played a fair bit and actually played relatively well at times too. So it wouldn't be, again, a complete shock if a team did take a shot on him. There's lots of teams looking especially for upgrades on their number 3 goalie position, especially with the taxi squad and expanded rosters this year. So we'll find out at noon Eastern time tomorrow if either player will be wearing a different jersey or if they'll be staying put and getting reassigned. Now, as I mentioned as well, we have a variety of other things to talk about here today. Some trade talk that we might see in the near future. I do want to touch on Jack Eichel again. Now, I know he's a player that's probably not going anywhere anytime soon, but as the situation in Buffalo continues to not get any better and the losses continue to pile up, you have to think the frustration there is mounting. And basically, from what I've been following along with some sources that are monitoring that situation closely, it seems as though many feel that there will be some kind of a resolution in place by the end of the season, or by the NHL trade deadline, I should say. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see an Eichel trade, but it is a possibility. And I think the Sabres are only going to go down that road again if Eichel approaches them and says that he wants to be moved, because obviously at this point I think they're going to continue to try to get things right and build around him. He's a centerpiece that most teams would love to have. Now, of course, there's other scenarios at play that maybe the Sabres make some other moves to try to bolster his line mates and players around him. That's a possibility. They've obviously battled a lot this year between injuries and COVID stuff, so it hasn't been a great year for the Sabres, but it's, if there's any other team, you might chalk it up as an off year, but unfortunately for them, it's been a trend for a very long time. Now, of course, when it comes to where could things end up, well, if a trade did take place, I know we've talked a lot about the Rangers and the Los Angeles Kings, and I do firmly believe they would be front and center in there making some pretty interesting offers. But one team that I would not completely rule out is the Boston Bruins, and that might come as for 2 reasons. One, he very well could have a preference to go to Boston. Obviously, he's got connections there to play for the Bruins, and of course, they're at a situation now where their top 2 centers in Bergeron and Krejci are not spring chickens anymore. Krejci's in the final year of his deal. I know there is talk that he could possibly sign a less expensive, shorter extension for a couple extra years, and I wouldn't completely rule that out, but if they had an opportunity to grab a guy like Jack Eichel, they might be forced to move on from a guy like Krejci, and I think that's a deal that they would do. I mean, at the end of the day, it gets them a lot younger with a lot more upside, so I think they probably take their opportunity to do that if it presents itself. Now, what exactly would the Bruins obviously have to trade? Well, I'm sure the Sabres, like any team with a guy like Eichel, they're going to want a lot if it does indeed happen. So we will see. But they're going to have to give up some of those young pieces that they might not want to. But I mean, I would imagine a winger like a Jake DeBrusk would be front and center. I'm sure that the Sabres are going to be asking for a guy like Stanika as well. Maybe one of their blue liners like a McAvoy or Carlo. I don't know. I mean, you don't want to give up too much because then you get stronger at center but weaker in other spots. So hard to say what makes sense for Boston, but obviously, I think there would be mutual interest there. And even though Jack Eichel doesn't have trade protection in his contract, the player is going to want to, have as much influence as he can, and the team acquiring him is going to want him to be happy and want to stay for a long time. What I think here, based on sources that I've been following along, is I wouldn't completely rule out the Bruins as being involved here. And again, not to say that he's going to be traded, but there is a strong possibility that even if it doesn't happen by the deadline, it could carry over to the offseason. But I think as we approach the deadline, we're going to see teams calling Buffalo and making their trade offer and their pitches. And if the one really intrigues Kevyn Adams, he's going to have to really sit down, take a long, hard thought about it, talk to the ownership group, and see where they proceed and how they get things back on track. Because clearly things are a mess in Buffalo, and it's hard to say what they got to do exactly to right the ship there. Now, another team to watch is Columbus. We already seen them make a significant deal acquiring Jack Roslovic and Patrick Laine, and for the most part, I think it's fair to say that those two players have fit in nicely and have done their fair share to contribute to the offensive output in Columbus, which is something they wanted to increase. But at the end of the day, the Jackets are not a better team right now. They're still near the bottom of their division. They're not really trending towards being a playoff team, and clearly that's not acceptable. They're taking some steps back. I do have to think that to some degree that a guy like John Tortorella behind the bench could be in trouble. But I do think before that happens that we're going to see GM Jarmo Kekalainen maybe make some more trades. I know Elliot Friedman mentioned it last night on Hockey Night in Canada about the Jackets, that there's been some rumblings that a number of deals could be being discussed, and he does think that it's quite real possibility we could see some trades sometime in the near future. There wasn't exactly details given on what players could be involved, but, at the same time, something's got to give here. Maybe they trade one of their goaltenders. I mean, they have Korpisalo and Elvis Merzlikins under, decent contracts. They were rumored to be looking to move one of them in the offseason to make themselves, acquire some other assets here, like some, especially for forwards, which they need. And to a degree, you can make an argument here that they've made some upgrades this year, but there's still more that could be made. I'm not completely convinced they're overly in love with the Max Domi acquisition at this point, especially seeing how well Josh Anderson's done in Montreal. So I don't know what they're going to do exactly, but according to Friedman, and I do tend to agree based on the trends here, that it looks as though there could be more moves coming from Columbus. That big blockbuster trade we saw earlier is probably not all it's going to take here, and clearly something has to be done if they want to have any hopes of getting into the playoffs this season. Now, another interesting situation to watch, which has been mentioned by numerous NHL insiders, and it's kind of makes a lot of sense here, and it's the possibility of the Florida Panthers being in trouble of losing their star goaltender. And yes, we're not talking about the $10 million man, Sergei Bobrovsky. Unfortunately, Bobrovsky has not had a great start to the season for the second year in a row, and Chris Driedger, the much cheaper, somewhat veteran minor league goaltender, has had more of an opportunity in the last year or two, has kind of stolen his job. I mean, Driedger, who went through the Ottawa Senators system and at one point was basically let go because he didn't really see a long-term fit there, is now in his later 20s and has gotten a decent opportunity. He's stuck with his game. He's put his time in the minors, and he's found himself a chance here with Florida over the last couple of years, and he's done really well. Now, he's a pending unrestricted free agent, so technically Florida doesn't even technically have to make him available in the expansion draft here, which is Seattle being the team that has been linked to maybe being interested in Driedger, or something that the NHL insiders feel that they have a very, very close eye on, because obviously they're going to want a mixture of players at a variety of spots when it comes to contract, age, and all that kind of stuff. And he could be a really good piece that's not going to cost too much. He's only making around $800,000 now, but if he gets to play a lot for the remainder of this season, obviously he's going to drive up his value, which is only fair and makes sense. But still, the fact that he's only had one big year on his resume is not going to get him a huge contract. But still, they're going to be forced to protect Bobrovsky in the expansion draft, which is really unfortunate for Florida, because if they exposed him, that they wouldn't take him. I mean, he's playing terrible for that kind of money, and there's just no way anybody's going to touch that. But they gave him a full no-move clause. So unless he's willing to waive, and I pretty much can guarantee he won't, then they're going to be forced to protect him whether they really want to or not. And if a guy like Driedger is signed and extended, then he's going to be made available. Now, there's also the possibility that they don't sign him and they expose Samuel Montembeault, but then they're at risk of losing him to free agency anyways. And some wondered if maybe the Seattle Kraken could come calling and try to figure out a way to make an acquisition before Driedger actually becomes an actual free agent. So maybe once the season's done, they could maybe offer a couple of picks or something in the form of draft picks in order to make the acquisition and then get him signed and maybe be the face of the franchise like Vegas did with Marc-Andre Fleury. Now, different scenario there, but he's young enough and he's got the pedigree right now showing what he can do in Florida that he'd be a really solid option for starting goaltending. I mean, they have lots of other decent goaltenders that might be available to them as well here, but, he could be the guy that could be potentially starting and not costing too much, which is great for an expansion team. So we will see what happens. And then regardless of where he goes, it doesn't matter if it's Seattle or not, the fact that they're forced to protect Bobrovsky is likely going to mean that the odds of them losing Chris Driedger are extremely high, which is unfortunate given how he's played since he's been in their organization and how poorly Bobrovsky has played. But if he doesn't go to Seattle, you think at some point they might be forced to trade him somewheres, which is, unfortunate. But lots of teams looking for goaltending, but could he be the first Seattle Kraken perhaps ahead of the draft to become the first player in franchise history? I guess we will have to wait and be seen on that one. Now, lastly here, I want to touch on a potential deal that seems to be brewing between the Nashville Predators and the Philadelphia Flyers. I've seen multiple reports today indicating that these two teams are reportedly engaged in trade discussions, the main centerpiece being defenseman Matthias Ekholm of the Predators. Now, of course, we reported before, based on Elliot Friedman's reports, that Nashville is certainly willing to sell many of their assets here, not too many untouchables, and obviously a guy like Ekholm who's on a pretty good contract with this year and one more year left. It would be a very attractive asset to any team looking to go on a deep playoff run. He really adds a new dimension back for most Blue Lines being strong defensively, and the Flyers have been looking to replace what they had with Matt Niskanen all year. This could very well be the way they do it. Now, I've also seen reports that they're interested in more than just Ekholm on the Flyers roster, so some believe that they might be looking hard at forward Mikael Granlund as well. Now, obviously, that would really add a lot of depth to both the forward group and the defense group. And what could the return possibly be? Well, I'd have to think first and foremost that the Predators would be willing to take Shane Gostisbehere. I mean, obviously, from a money perspective, they would have to take something relatively significant. Both of those players are making $3.75 million, so they have to clear out, close to $7 million roughly in space. Well, Gostisbehere's contract would take up a big chunk of that. Obviously, he'd have to be more than, there would have to be more than that included. But there's also been reports that the Nashville Predators have also been scouting the American Hockey League team of the Flyers, which is unusual. They're not in the same division this year. They're not going to be playing each other all season long, so it doesn't make sense for them to be scouting unless they're looking at players when it comes to potential trades. Now, the Flyers have some very interesting players that they could be taking a look at, not only in the minor leagues, but in college hockey as well. I mean, the Flyers still have some good, interesting prospects. Like when it comes to the forwards, they could be looking at a guy like Matthew Strome or Isaac Ratcliffe. They have Bobby Brink in college, for example. That's another possibility. On the blue line, they've got some guys like Cam York at the University of Michigan. And in the American Hockey League, they got Hogberg, Zamula, Wiley, and Millman as well. So it's hard to say who they'd have their most interested in. Maybe they're in the process of trying to figure that out. I mean, you could probably throw Jay O'Brien in there as well, also playing college hockey is at the University of Denver. So clearly, they have some interesting guys there that could be of interest to the Nashville Predators. They're looking to get obviously younger and start the process of a bit of a rebuild. So this is a deal that makes sense, but to a lot of degree for the current year, if the Flyers want to really go for it and kind of stock up, the only concern I would have is the expansion draft. As I mentioned about Florida being at risk to lose a goaltender, now the Flyers would be kind of forced at this point to consider protecting forward defensemen. If they acquire Ekholm, they're not going to want to expose him in the expansion draft. So obviously, you've already got Ivan Provorov, you've already got Travis Sanheim, and you've already got Philippe Myers, who I would think they'd want to protect too, but Ekholm makes 4, and they either go with 4D protected, which leaves a lot less forwards protected, or Philippe Myers gets exposed. That's another possibility. So hard to say how the Flyers are looking at this, but it's certainly something that's in the process of being discussed. And maybe other deals are made later as well. I don't know, but it'd be an interesting move for the current season. I would just wonder how that would impact them expansion-wise and what their plans could be. I mean, if they go the route of 8 skaters and 1 goalie instead of 7-3-1, then they could obviously have more forwards exposed, which could mean some other longer-time veteran guys with big contracts like maybe Giroux or Voracek. Maybe you're left available. It's hard to say how the Flyers would proceed there, and obviously a lot of that would probably depend on how their playoff run would go. But these trade talks apparently are getting intensified, and there's lots of scouting going on, so it wouldn't be shocking if we see deals happen here sometime in the near future. So let me know your thoughts on that potential deal. What you think makes sense for each franchise? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.